That every teenager, and actually every adult too, needs to know. 3 numbers that you need to know. The first number is 4. Everybody say 4. All right, come on, you got to remember this. You ain't going to remember it with some half on it. Say 4. 4. Give me a 4 in the air. So 4. 4. About 5, about 25% of you there. And about 4, you threw up the 4. Give me a 4. Come on. 4 stands for that we are currently on pace to only reach 4% of this generation. Now, if you were to rewind yourself back to like George Bush and Bill Clinton, that age bracket, they're part of what's called the baby boomers. See, what happened was after World War II, back in like, I don't know, 30s, 40s, something like that, when all the men came back from World War II, they had been away from their wives for several years, and when they came home, all of a sudden some stuff happened in the bedroom, and boom, there was some babies. And so there's the baby boomers. But it was not just that they were coming back from war, but it was a time in our history where everybody had a positive outlook, you know? It was like a positive time, and so people were happy. They weren't wanting to have a lot of children. And so they had so many children, and then when they grew up, there was so many children, and when they went to school, there was not enough room. It was overcrowded, and they had to build brand new schools. So when the baby boomers were growing up, it's like everything revolved around them. They got new schools, they had everything going for them. And so the baby boomers, they've kind of shaped our country as they've grown up, because they've, for all up until now, been the hugest generation in the history of our country. And out of the baby boomers, I don't know how many of you ever heard of Billy Graham? Raise your hand, Billy Graham. He's an old dude now, and he's almost died. He has a son named Franklin Graham, and he used to do crusades in these big, he was in Soldier Field like 20 years ago, and they had like 100,000 people before they had like shrank it. It used to be bigger. And Billy Graham, even when he was younger, worked for an organization called Youth for Christ. That's where he started out with. And he would travel the country, and a whole bunch of men just like him would travel the country preaching to youth all across this country. And with the baby boomers, 1 out of 3, or 35%, about 35%, made a decision in their teen years to accept Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior. So that's the baby boomers. Then came after baby boomers was Generation X, which is my generation. I'm kind of at the tail end of it, I think. Depends. Different people classify the years differently and stuff, but I fall in Generation X. In my generation, baby boomers 35%, 1 out of 3. My generation 18%, almost 1 out of 5. Big drop, almost half, made a decision in their teen years. Your generation, some call it a bunch of different names. Bridger generation, millennial generation, Generation Y, a lot of different names. I'm just going to call it millennial generation. You're growing up in the new millennium. Your generation, at the current rate of evangelism, and I guess there's been a couple different people that agree with this statistic, but one of the most famous guys is George Barna, who's used to work for Gallup poll, those political polls and stuff, and poll the whole nation. So he does this stuff professionally. He just ain't making a few phone calls. He does it scientific methods of doing research. And they have found that in your generation, that only 4%, say 4, 4% claim to be believers. That's 1 out of 25. Now, I don't know, we got, how many people in this room, Steve? About 100? 125 people. So 4% of the people in this room would be 5 people. So if you can stand up, Eric. What's your name? Ariana, could you set up? Can you stand up, dude? Thanks. And how about that guy right there? Now, 4% of the people in this room is right there. I'm standing up too. This would represent, hold up now, listen clear, this is how serious this is. This would represent how many people in your generation are going to heaven. And everybody that's sitting down right now, unless a miracle of God happens, are on their way to hell. So when you go to your classroom, there's only 25 people in the class, which we know that's not true in Chicago, maybe like 50 up in your classroom. Maybe you and one other person is a believer, or maybe you're the only person who knows and follows the gospel of Jesus Christ in your class. Stay standing for a second. Now here's the dilemma. The next number is 5. Everybody say 5. 5 years, most of this generation will be in their 20s. It's kind of like a bell curve, they call it, or like a curve. Like if you were to match the year when the millennial generation, everybody was born, it'll be right around 2010 when most of them have already been in their 20s. Just the peak of this generation, in 5 years, the majority of you will be in their 20s. Now that's significant because the next number, everybody say 5. You take 4 and 5, that gives you 45. You multiply that times 2, you get the last number, 90. Everybody say 90. It's around 90% of those who come to Christ do so before they're 20. So pretty much what those numbers are telling us, that if a miracle of God, if an outbreak of the gospel doesn't happen, chances are these people are never going to get saved. Chances are they don't accept Christ while they're in high school, and before they hit 20, chances are they're never going to get saved. 90% of people who accept Christ do so while they're a teenager. And despite the fact that you feel like the gospel's uncool to share with your friends, despite the fact that sometimes it feels like it's a misconception, it's a false feeling, but despite the fact that it feels like, hey, if you share the gospel, you might get laughed at or they don't want to hear it. The reality is, right now, they're more open to Jesus than they'll ever be the rest of their life. There's a human emergency in our country. You know how big your generation is? I read in one book, and it depends how you do the years, but the book I looked at last week in the bookstore said 72 million in the millennial generation. 72 million, that's bigger than over 160 countries. There's only like 190 something countries on our planet. Your generation alone is bigger than about 160 countries on planet Earth. And out of the 72 million, about 69 million currently are on their way to hell. And you know what? There's youth pastors, we got youth conferences, we have Christian hip-hop artists, we have books, we have Christian radio, we have conferences. I mean, we got state-of-the-art churches with projectors and laptops and computers. We got all this stuff going for us in our country, all this technology, all these talents, all these gifts, and more is being done to reach youth than ever before. However, we're reaching them less like never before. Never before in the history of our country has there been such a spiritual emergency. I don't know if you guys can even just imagine. In this room you think, hey, maybe mostly everybody's a believer. So you're sitting down, but you know you're not going to hell. But can you imagine faces of the lost at your school, your classroom? You guys can sit down. I want to show a video clip that was summarized with these numbers that we just went over. But imagine if things are, you think the gangs are bad, you think the schools are bad, you think things are bad now, when 1 out of 3 adults in our country claim to be Christians. I don't know how many really are Christians, but they claim to understand the gospel and know the gospel and say, I'm a born-again Christian. You think things are bad now? Can you imagine 10, 20, 30, 40 years when your generation is running the country?